The following podcast contains discussions of wealth inequality, sexist laws, and trash men who have inappropriate relationships with minors. Also, spoilers. Lots of spoilers. Ready? Let's dig in. The dancing hall is hot and stuffy. Too small, really, to fit everyone there. And it's no wonder, as all the single ladies and their mothers had made sure to attend this specific gathering. After all, it's quite rare to have two very eligible bachelors in their midst. They were handsome, rich, and friends, supposedly. Though the crowd quietly wonders why. Two more different gentlemen they had yet to meet. One is so cheerful and light, the other so dark and sour. The friendly one catches his buddy silently standing in the sidelines and goes, "Hey pal, why aren't you dancing?" His friend replies, "You're dancing with the only pretty girl in the room." "That's not true," the nice one says. "Look, there's her sister. She's cute too." And the awful one is like, "Meh." What a jerk. The object of this exchange hears everything. She laughs it off, but she's insulted. Elizabeth Bennet may be many, many things, but the one thing she isn't is meh. Mr. Darcy just doesn't know it yet. Hi, I'm Gabby, and this is Digestibles, a podcast about all the books you were told to read but probably didn't. Today, we're gonna take a look at one of the most beloved love stories of all time. Wait, I know what you're thinking. Didn't we already do Romeo and Juliet? No, this is different. Written by the mother of all rom-coms, queen of snark, and maker of the savage burn, Jane Austen. Yes, I'm talking about Pride and Prejudice. During her time, most writers were writing about the so-called bigger, aka dramatic, things. Austen wrote about life, her life, filled with ordinary people, places, and events, where manners made a man and marriage made a woman, and hot tea was always served, or spilled, politely in living rooms. Most of her readers could relate, and it made her wildly popular both then and now. In fact, why are you listening to me when you could be reading it yourself? I'm kidding. Don't go. Stay. Please.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters.
Mrs. Bennet has 5 daughters and none of them are married. Which wouldn't be so much of a problem now in 2020, but welcome to the early 1800s, where women can't vote, can't go to college, can't legally own anything, and the only respectable occupation for any young woman born above the working class was either to marry rich or die trying. And Mrs. Bennet will die trying for her daughters. See, when her husband dies, they'll be kicked out of their house with barely any money to support them. All because of this law called the entail, where only sons or the closest male relative can inherit land and property. Marriage is, unfortunately, the only answer. And guess what? A certain gentleman has just moved into the neighborhood. And the tea is that he has an income of $5,000 a year. Best news of all? He's single. Now, if only Mr. Bennet would go out and introduce himself to Mr. Bingley, bro it up, and introduce him to his daughters. Which reminds me, let's meet the girls. Jane, the eldest, is the pretty one. Elizabeth or Lizzie is the witty one. Mary is the serious one. Catherine or Kitty is, well, she's just there. And Lydia is 15 and the flirty one. So now that the whole female part of the household is excited about the town's newest bachelor, they need to get the male portion all hyped up about it too. If only Mr. Bennet were more useful and less sarcastic. He likes to ignore his wife, and though Mrs. Bennet can be an annoying nag, At least she's looking out for her children. Mrs. Bennet knows she needs to get help from somewhere else. Her frenemy, only because she has an unmarried daughter of her own, Lady Lucas confirms that Mr. Bingley is single, handsome, charming, rich, and most importantly, he's attending the upcoming party and he's bringing guests. His 2 sisters, his brother-in-law, and... drumroll, please! A friend. Enter Bachelor number 2. Like his friend Mr. Bingley, Mr. Darcy is good-looking and rich. Like, super rich. But unlike his friend, he isn't charming. In fact, he's downright rude. He's snobby, makes no effort to converse or dance with anyone, and worse, he disses Elizabeth. Elizabeth promises she's never, ever, ever going to dance with him. Ever. He confides in his friend that he really, really likes her, and Darcy says he thinks Jane smiles too much. Okay, bucket of sunshine you are, Mr. Darcy. And so it goes for the next few days. Everyone in town loves Mr. Bingley and tolerates Mr. Darcy. Basically, being rude in 19th century Britain is a capital sin and may result in you getting cancelled. It's not called polite society for nothing. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is too busy shipping Jane and Bingley together to notice that somebody can't stop staring at her.
Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attentions to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty. He had looked at her without admiration at the ball, and when they next met, he looked at her only to criticize. But no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she hardly had a good feature in her face, than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. To this discovery succeeded some others equally mortifying. Though he had detected with a critical eye more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figure to be light and pleasing. And in spite of his asserting that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by their easy playfulness. Of this, she was perfectly unaware. To her, he was only the man who made himself agreeable nowhere, and who had not thought her handsome enough to dance with.
So Darcy is all heart eyes around Elizabeth now. He's always hanging around her, watching every breath she takes and every move she makes. Eventually, Elizabeth notices that he keeps listening in on her conversations. She brushes it off as him just looking for more faults with her. Ha! Keep believing that, sis. At one party, the host tries to get them to dance together, and this time, Darcy is all game. But Elizabeth sticks to her promise and refuses. Mr. Darcy is shocked. He's usually the one who rejects and is never the rejectee. Also, Bingley's sister Caroline is totally annoyed with Lizzie now because she wants Mr. Darcy all to herself. Unfortunately, Darcy is too busy thinking about Elizabeth's fine eyes to pay attention to her. One day, Jane is invited by Bingley's sisters to have lunch at their home, Netherfield Hall. Mrs. Bennet, the genius schemer, decides Jane should go on horseback instead of riding a carriage so that if it rains, she'll be stranded there. And what do you know? It works. A little too well, because Jane gets sick in the downpour, so she's forced to stay with the Bingleys until she recovers. Mrs. Bennet morphs into Kris Jenner and is like, "You're doing amazing, sweetie," at Jane's misery. Lizzie ends up walking 5 kilometers from her house to Netherfield to check on Jane. She drags mud into the hallway when she arrives. Caroline thinks it's unladylike, but Mr. Darcy doesn't care. He thinks Lizzie looks pretty either way. Lizzie stays to care for her sister. The only thing she hates is talking to Darcy and Bingley's conceited sisters, so she amuses herself by constantly throwing shade at them. It just makes her cuter to Darcy. They spend their time sniping at each other. Or flirting. Honestly, it's hard to know the difference anymore. Caroline tries to steal his attention away from Elizabeth, but she is consigned to whatever the 1800s version of being seen zone is. What she doesn't know is, though Darcy admits that he has a thing for Elizabeth, he won't really pursue her seriously because she's not his equal. What a d***head. Mrs. Bennet and the rest of her daughters also visit to check on Jane. Lydia manages to convince Bingley to throw a ball soon. Jane recovers a couple of days later and sadly leaves without a proposal from Bingley. As mentioned earlier, Mrs. Bennet's problem is that soon as Mr. Bennet dies, everything goes to his closest male heir. Obviously, the quickest solution to this is to marry one of her daughters to their cousin who will inherit. Ew. As gross as that sounds, marriage to your cousin at that time was totally acceptable. Unfortunately for them, said male cousin is Mr. Collins, and he's in town to visit. He's kind of ridiculous and thinks he's the best, even though he's only a poor pastor, therefore not that high up in the social ladder. Have I mentioned he's also weirdly obsessed with his boss, Lady Catherine de Bourgh? Mr. Collins wants to marry Jane at first, but that would ruin her chances with Mr. Bingley. Mrs. Bennet gets him to transfer his interest to Elizabeth instead. More on that later. Collins is not the only newcomer in town. The military have arrived to the excitement of Kitty and Lydia. One day, the sisters walk to town and meet cute with a charming soldier named Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth likes him, and so does everyone else. She notices one person who doesn't, though, and it's Mr. Darcy. Wickham has a lot to say about that. To recap, he and Darcy grew up together, and Darcy's father promised Wickham a job in his estate. But when the elder Darcy died, the current Darcy decided not to respect his father's wishes, which forced Wickham to find another way to live, and that's how he ended up in the military. And Elizabeth's opinion of Darcy sinks even lower.
I had not thought Mr. Darcy so bad as this. Though I have never liked him, I had not thought so very ill of him. I had supposed him to be despising his fellow creatures in general, but did not suspect him of descending to such malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this.
After a few minutes' reflection, however, she continued.
I do remember his boasting one day, at Netherfield, of the implacability of his resentments, of his having an unforgiving temper. His disposition must be dreadful.
Elizabeth is excited for the Netherfield ball. She wants to dance with Wickham, but she can't find him in the crush of people. Unluckily, Mr. Collins finds her first and asks her to dance. It's awkward. She finds out that Wickham isn't there and is so bummed that she accidentally agrees to dance with Mr. Darcy. That's awkward-er. Guess you can say her milkshake brings all the boys to the yard, just not the boy she actually likes. And then, shenanigans. Her family decides to be extra embarrassing. The worst is Mrs. Bennet bragging out loud that Jane is going to marry Mr. Bingley. But Jane and Bingley are too into each other to notice, but Darcy overhears that. Whoops. The next day, Mr. Collins asks to speak to Elizabeth alone. This is code for, I'm going to propose to you now. To Elizabeth, this is more of a threat. He starts by pointing out that her obvious discomfort, or what he calls modesty, is pleasing. Yikes. Next, he lays out his reasons for marrying. Spoiler alert, it's mostly because Lady Catherine told him to. Then finally, he reminds her that he's inheriting the house from her father and he doesn't blame her for bringing nothing to the marriage and he won't make a big deal out of it. Elizabeth answers, Thanks, but no thanks. Apparently, no is not a word in Mr. Collins' vocabulary. He thinks it means, ask me again later. Elizabeth repeats, no, nope, nuh-uh, niet, nein. She means it. Mr. Collins thinks her parents will get her to change her mind. You keep thinking that. Mrs. Bennet is freaking out. She yells at her husband to force Elizabeth to accept Mr. Collins. Mr. Bennet, who is not so useless when it comes to his favorite daughter Lizzie, disagrees with his wife. So Mr. Collins sashays away into the arms of Lizzie's friend and neighbor, Charlotte Lucas. Barely a few days later, he proposes, and she accepts. That was quick. Charlotte isn't rich or pretty, and worst of all, she's old. At 27, her future is destined to be miserable, and Mr. Collins is not that bad. Elizabeth tries to support her friend. If this were the 2020s, not marrying at 27 is no big deal. More bad news for Mrs. Bennet. Jane receives a letter from Caroline Bingley. They've left Netherfield to go to London and won't be back in the near future. Jane is heartbroken. Time passes. Mr. Bennet's brother, Mr. Gardiner, arrives with his wife, and they invite Jane to stay with them in London to cheer her up. In the meantime, Elizabeth sees Wickham flirting with another girl who has way more money than her. She discovers she doesn't really care. Also, she has somewhere else to be. Charlotte asks her to come visit. Her husband's boss, Lady Catherine, invites them to her home. And if Elizabeth thought Darcy was a snob, Lady Catherine is worse. She talks and assumes that everyone's opinion except hers is wrong. To make matters worse, her nephew arrives to visit her, and whom should it be but Mr. Darcy. Charlotte suspects that Darcy is really here to see Elizabeth. He keeps calling at their house, sitting stiffly and staring at Lizzie. He also keeps bumping into her when she's out walking. Weird. Charlotte teases Elizabeth that Darcy is in love with her. Elizabeth doesn't believe her. She's still in denial. One day, instead of bumping into Mr. Darcy, she sees Lady Catherine's other nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam. Somehow, their conversation turns into a story of how recently Darcy saved his friend Bingley from making a bad marriage. He means Jane, of course. This makes Elizabeth mad. So very mad. And Darcy, with his perfect timing, decides to pay her another visit. But this time, instead of staring at her awkwardly, he has something more to say. In fact, he loves her and wants to marry her. Elizabeth is like, what? He continues, but you're beneath me. Your family is gross and I don't really want to be in love with you. Bold strategy, Mr. Darcy. Let's see if it pays off.
Elizabeth felt herself growing more angry every moment, yet she tried to the utmost to speak with composure when she said,
"You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy. If you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any other way, then as it spared me the concern which I might have felt in refusing you had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner."
She saw him start at this, but he said nothing. And she continued.
"You could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, were such as to form that groundwork of disapprobation, on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike, and I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry.
What has poor Elizabeth done in her life to deserve two dreadful proposals? She calls Darcy ungentlemanlike, which is a big F you to someone like him. Also, did he really think she'd say yes to the man who ruined her sister's happiness? Mr. Darcy doesn't deny it. He was just doing his friend a favor. Bros before hoes, you know. Elizabeth then brings up Wickham, and it's now Darcy's turn to get mad. He can't believe that this is her opinion of him. He says, "I'm sorry I called your family horrible, but at least I didn't lie." He accepts his rejection and leaves. The next day, he finds her on her walk and hands her a letter. In it, he admits that he was wrong about Jane, but he'd totally do it again because he didn't think she was in love with Bingley anyway. But he'd like to defend his behavior with Wickham. Darcy did offer him the job his father promised, but Wickham said he'd rather study law. So Darcy gave him money instead. A few years later, Wickham shows up with no money and no law degree. He says he wants the job now, but Darcy refuses. In revenge, Wickham decides to seduce Darcy's sister. Worse, she's only 15. He gets her to elope, but Darcy finds out just in time. Elizabeth finally realizes what an idiot she's been. Darcy's awful, but at least he's not groom a 15-year-old awful. She admits she's been prejudiced against Darcy since the beginning and she wants to apologize. But, too late. Darcy has already left. Later, Elizabeth meets up with Jane in London and they go home together. When they arrive in town, they meet their sisters at an inn to learn all that's happened while they were away. Lydia can't seem to stop talking about Wickham. Uh-oh. Lydia is depressed because the militia is leaving. Then she's invited to go to Brighton with the colonel's wife. Brighton is the party town in England, like Florida or La Union. So Lydia really wants to go. Elizabeth tries to convince her dad not to agree, but he wants Lydia to be someone else's problem for once. Ugh, Dad. Elizabeth's also invited to a summer trip, this time with her aunt and uncle to Derbyshire. Guess who happens to live there? You guessed it, eligible bachelor number 2, Mr. Darcy. Mrs. Gardiner wants to pay a visit to his legendary estate, Pemberley. At that time, big houses were open to visitors, kinda like museums. Elizabeth doesn't really want to go, but they learn that the family is out of town. Ooh. As their carriage approaches the mansion, her anxiety turns into excitement as she sees more of Darcy's estate. You could say that Elizabeth falls in love with Pemberley at first sight. And to think all of it could have been hers. The housekeeper shows them around and calls Darcy the best boss ever. She points out a portrait of him and asks if Elizabeth thinks he's handsome. Okay, fine. He's cute. I guess. They finish the tour, and just when they're about to leave, suddenly Darcy is walking across the lawn. Their eyes meet and everything stops. Elizabeth blushes. And so does Darcy. He comes forward and greets her politely. She introduces him to her aunt and uncle and tries to concentrate while screaming internally. And Darcy is actually friendly? Why is he being nice? He's so nice that Mrs. Gardiner asks her why she hates him. Then they start spending time together. Darcy wants to introduce Elizabeth to his sister, which is kind of a big deal. Georgiana Darcy is sweet and knows there's something going on between her brother and Elizabeth. But before she can bang their heads together and make them kiss, Elizabeth receives 2 letters from Jane. Wickham's fondness for minors has struck again. And this time, his victim is Lydia. Dun dun dun! At first, they think that the couple has run away to Scotland, which was like the Las Vegas of their time for quickie weddings. They didn't. It looks like they went to London instead. If Wickham hasn't married her yet and word gets out, then she's ruined. And when a girl is ruined, it affects the rest of her family as well. As long as Lydia is a scandal, her sisters will be labeled unmarriageable. Darcy can't marry her now. Lizzie is freaking out. Darcy notices and asks what's the matter. She bursts into tears and tells him everything. Darcy blames himself for not telling everyone of Wickham's true character.
Darcy made no answer. He seemed scarcely to hear her, and was walking up and down the room in earnest meditation. His brow contracted, his air gloomy. Elizabeth soon observed and instantly understood it. Her power was sinking. Everything must sink under such a proof of family weakness, such an assurance of the deepest disgrace. She could neither wonder nor condemn, but the belief of his self-conquest brought nothing consolatory to her bosom, afforded no palliation of her distress. It was, on the contrary, exactly calculated to make her understand her own wishes, and never had she so honestly felt that she could have loved him as now, when all love must be vain.
So, Darcy returns to Pemberley and Elizabeth to her home. Mr. Gardiner and Mr. Bennet go to London to track down Lydia. They find out that Wickham has a lot of gambling debts. Lizzie thinks they'll never get married now because Lydia can't afford his lifestyle. They hear news that the couple have been found. They're not married yet, but Wickham will agree if Mr. Bennet sends him a little money every year. Mr. Bennet can't afford much, so Elizabeth wonders if her uncle paid Wickham off. Elizabeth also regrets that she ever told Darcy about this situation, as she's heard nothing from him since. Lydia and Wickham arrive on their wedding day, acting like they haven't made the worst mistake of their lives. Lydia can't stop bragging about being married. She's the type to clog her Instagram feed with nauseatingly sweet photos to show everyone how in love they are, even though, IRL, Wickham is just not that into her. One day, while Lydia is telling Elizabeth about her wedding, she blurts out that Mr. Darcy was there. Elizabeth is super surprised. It's supposed to be a secret. Lizzie doesn't want to ask Lydia for more deets, so she writes to her aunt. And here's what actually happened. It's Darcy who finds Lydia and Wickham in London. He tries to convince her to leave him, but she's too young to believe that Wickham is really that big of a douche. So, Darcy pays off all of Wickham's debts and gives him a fortune to marry Lydia. Elizabeth has so many feelings about this, and honestly, at this point, same. Eventually, Lydia and Wickham leave, to the sadness of Mrs. Bennet and the relief of everyone else. But it's not too long until the Bennets have some good news. Mr. Bingley is back! Yay! And he's brought Darcy with him. Opposite of yay. The two become frequent guests in the Bennet household, Bingley being nice and Darcy being quiet as usual. Elizabeth is confused because doesn't he like her? But he's not talking to her, so she's determined not to think about him ever again. But like anyone in love, this resolution lasts about 2 seconds. Jane also thinks she's over Mr. Bingley now. Spoiler alert, she's not. A couple of days later, Mr. Bingley finally proposes and Jane accepts. She's so happy that she wishes Elizabeth could also be happy like her. Elizabeth jokes that if she has very good luck, she'll meet another Mr. Collins. Woo! About a week later, early in the morning, the Bennets have a visitor. It's Lady Catherine. She wants Elizabeth to promise not to get engaged to Darcy because she wants him to marry her daughter. Elizabeth stands up for herself and says, no, she won't promise a thing. Lady Catherine calls her ungrateful and leaves. Mr. Bennet laughs at the whole thing because he knows Lizzie and Darcy hate each other. Elizabeth laughs with him even though she'd really rather cry. Finally, Lizzie gets some alone time with Mr. Darcy. While out on a walk, she tries to thank him for everything he did for her family. Mr. Darcy says she'd rather thank him for herself because she must know that he did it all for her.
Elizabeth was too much embarrassed to say a word. After a short pause, her companion added, "You are too generous to trifle with me. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever." Elizabeth, feeling all the more than common awkwardness and anxiety of his situation, now forced herself to speak, and immediately, though not very fluently, gave him to understand that her sentiments had undergone so material a change since the period to which he alluded as to make her receive with gratitude and pleasure his present assurances. The happiness which this reply produced was such as he had probably never felt before, and he expressed himself on the occasion as sensibly and as warmly as a man violently in love can be supposed to do.
They kiss and... Wait, this is the 1800s, they don't kiss. But they do make up, apologize to each other, and can live happily ever after now. Man, we love good character development. But first, they have to tell her family. Everyone's confused, but she explains how she may not have liked him then, but she loves him now. She also jokes that she figured out she loved him as soon as she saw his house. Jane tells her to be serious. Mr. Bennet gives them his blessing, and finally, Mrs. Bennet can die a happy woman. While Pride and Prejudice is beloved as romance, it's not even that romantic. In fact, this slow-burn enemies-to-lover novel is all about the dollar bills, yo, and how it controls everyone, making them act silly like Mrs. Bennet, or maliciously like Wickham, or prideful like Darcy. But how much money are we talking about exactly? Let's do the math. Actually, no, let's have someone else do the math. I suck at that. In Catherine Turan's article, The Economics of Jane Austen's World, she writes that for Mr. Darcy to earn £10,000 a year, he must have an estimated fortune of £200,000. Without inflation, that's around 600,000 pesos a year with total estimated fortune of 12.5 million pesos. Which is a lot, but it wouldn't even put him on the Forbes list. Now let's see what happens when we adjust for inflation. Unfortunately, the calculator online only goes back to 1913, so I'll refer to the article, because again, they did the math. In 2020, £10,000 equals to around $18 million or almost 900 million pesos a year. That's basically how much Jeffree Star earns every year. But wait, there's more. His estimated net worth is around $350 million or roughly 18 billion pesos, which makes him not quite as loaded as Taylor Swift, but stacks of money above the likes of Lady Gaga and Katy Perry. And take note, this is only the income that he earns from investments. It doesn't even count how much his land in Pemberley is worth. Whoa, you get it, Lizzie. So if Mr. Darcy is part of the 1%, how about the Bennets? Honestly, they're not really that poor. Mr. Bennet earns £2,000 a year. That'll be almost 200 million pesos today. So why were they that desperate for money? Quite simply, Mr. Bennet never saved any. And because women were not allowed to inherit property, Lizzie and her sisters were, well, let's just say, starts with an F and rhymes with ducked. Elizabeth's income if her father had died would only be £40 a year. Jeez. Even Jane Austen herself couldn't escape from this, duckery. First, she couldn't publish her books under her own name. It wasn't exactly respectable. So they were all published anonymously. First by a lady. Then later by the author of Sense and Sensibility, or the author of Pride and Prejudice, and so on. It was only after her death that her name was finally attached as the writer. And then, she wasn't even paid properly. This was her second novel, and her first, Sense and Sensibility, earned her £140. She asked her publisher for £150 for the copyright, but he only agreed to £110. Considering how popular Pride and Prejudice is, all the TV shows, movies, books, she was robbed. Majorly robbed. But thank goodness it's the 21st century and we are done with this nonsense. Right? Come on, guys, right? And there we have it. Thanks for listening, you guys. I hope I was able to make Pride and Prejudice a little bit easier for you to digest. Once again, I'm Gabby, and you can find me at Gabby Pasqua Vox on Instagram and Twitter, or use the hashtag Digestibles Podcast. Thanks to Merrick for helping out with the narrations and Jazz for composing our theme. Join us again next week. Digestibles is part of Connect, a podcast network, bringing together entertaining stories to spark your imagination. For more awesome content, visit connectpodcast.net or follow us on social media at Connect Podcasts.